Hello, my name is Michael Albert, and I am the host of the podcast RevolutionZ. This week, for episode 25 of RevolutionZ, which is titled Participatory Polity 2, we have our first guest, Stephen Shalom. I met Stephen, I think, in 1966. We were both students at MIT, and we were both politically active together there and have been friends ever since. That is, for a bit over a half a century. Steve has been, over those years, a constant reminder of what it means to work for social change. He does it as a professor, he does it as a family member, he does it as a citizen, for a long time now in New Jersey, and he does it as a writer. Today he will be doing it as a guest on RevolutionZ, and I anticipate he will be back often once RevolutionZ attracts enough patrons to sustain regular guest appearances. Please check out www.patreon.com/RevolutionZ to help that along. Among Steve's many interests and pursuits bearing on social change, and not least as a political scientist and his daytime job at William Patterson University in New Jersey, he has developed a vision for conducting politics. His ideas for how we make collective decisions, how we carry out those decisions, and how we resolve disputes are quite different from what we are all typically familiar with in our daily experiences, and are also quite in tune with the ideas that have so far characterized RevolutionZ. So, Steve, welcome to RevolutionZ.
Glad to be here.
To start, Steve, just very broadly, what do you think are the main things a political vision needs to achieve?
Well, the political system is a way of making decisions, and any society has to have some method for doing that. Now, there's been some talk in leftist circles over the years that, once we get rid of economic oppression, once we have sort of a single class, we don't need politics anymore. And that was often the excuse given by a dictatorial, communist state. They would say, we don't need to have all those standard political liberties, etc., because we're just one class. Okay. But in fact, any group of people, no matter how wonderful the rest of the society is, if it doesn't have a way of making decisions that meet certain basic principles, it's going to be inadequate, and it's not going to be worthy of what we want. Let me just give an example or two. You might say, when there are no more classes, why do we? What kind of decisions will we make? Isn't all conflict, all disputes? Aren't they really conflict clashes of classes? No. People will always have arguments about things like children's rights, animal rights, allocation of scarce resources. How do we give out hearts for heart transplants and so on? Surrogacy, cloning. Remember, this is not a small sect we're making decisions for, where we assume a whole lot of basic agreement. But even on the left, those are issues that are divisive. So there has to be a way to make decisions. And that's what ParPolity, which is this rather awkward term I used because I wanted it to be consistent with a participatory economy and other participatory values. That's what ParPolity tries to do.
Okay, but it's one thing to make decisions. That's obviously one thing that's needed, as you point out. But it would be another thing to deal with, what happens to implement a decision? Or what happens when people violate a decision? Is that part of ParPolity too? Without clarifying yet how, is that also needed?
Sure. And so what most Americans learned in third grade about how there are three branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, that's really a pretty general characteristic of our lives. That is, legislative is how do we make decisions? The executive function is, okay, when we've got decisions, how do we carry them out? And the judicial function is there are always going to be disagreements about what we've done and how we've done it. How do we resolve those disagreements? And so those are, I think, universally three things that any political system has to address.
So then you'd say that a vision for politics would be some sort of specification, perhaps very broad, of how to accomplish legislation and execution and adjudication consistently with our values.
Exactly.
And so then what are those values?
Okay, so the reason this is a challenging project is that there are a lot of values that we care about, and therefore it's not just a problem of maximizing one, it's a problem of trying to have a package that as a whole does the best job of maximizing as many as possible. So some values. One of them is liberty, and by that I mean our ability and right to do what we want. Now, obviously that can't be unlimited because your liberty might intrude on my liberty. So what we're really trying to maximize there is the extent that people can do what they want without interfering with other people's right to do what they want. There will be complications, but that's sort of one basic point. A second thing we care about is justice, and by that I mean treating people the same. Human beings are moral beings, and they should have equal moral worth, and therefore we don't want a system that privileges one person or type of person over another. Third, we care about participation. That is, we don't just view a political system as something that generates results. It's also something we want to be involved in part because through participation, it defines who we are as human beings. That is, a political system is not something that says, take people with their given values and then generate good outcomes. No, it says, take people, but also help people become and define themselves to be the best they can be, want to be, and then through that process of participation, they'll have wishes and desires, and then we'd like the political system to reflect those wishes and desires in its outcomes. Now, you can overdo participation. You could have people going to meetings 24 hours a day, and every single thing that's done requires a meeting. That would be ludicrous from a time point of view. And, there might be some political fanatics, political junkies who are really into that. But we don't want to design a political system that only works for the fanatic. We want one that has a reasonable level of participation. Another value is solidarity. That is, we want a political system where our interests mesh. Meaning, imagine a political system where I could get very rich, but only if somebody else got very poor. Or they could get very rich only if I got very poor. In that kind of system, we are destined to be antagonistic, and we are destined to not develop human feelings between one another. But now imagine another political system where it turned out that whenever I made a decision that seemed to benefit me, it also seemed to benefit others. And when other people did that, the same thing happened. That would be a much preferable political system because it would be one that encouraged people to think of their fellow human beings as sharing their fate. And then the final value that I think is important is tolerance. We have a diverse community of people, whether it's one society or the globe, and people have different visions of what the good life is. And there are some, we hope, some visions that will not continue, ones of domination, etc. But it doesn't mean that I can tell you this is the way all human beings should live their lives. And therefore, we ought to have a political system that allows people, within the constraints of the other values, of realizing that different people are going to have somewhat different views of how the good life should be pursued, and we should be able to allow multiple paths to be taken towards the good life. So I think those are the values that we want any political system, any good political system, to reflect.
Okay, so maybe we should spend just a moment, not too long because we want to get on to what we're for, but perhaps you could say just a bit about why you think these aren't met now. Why don't we have justice? Why don't we have liberty? Why don't we have tolerance and solidarity? What is it about current relations, some of the big things in the political realm? We know, of course, that racism disrupts that, and sexism disrupts that, and class exploitation disrupts all those values. But is there anything about current politics per se, current way that the polity is organized, that the state is arranged, that we do legislation, adjudication, and then we execute shared plans? Is there anything about that impedes the values that you're describing? Do we really need a new political system, in other words? Or if we fixed everything else, would our political system then work nicely?
Okay, well, so a lot of the flaws in our political system are, in fact, can be traced to deep flaws in the economic system. And that's why when I thought about this, I said, okay, I'm going to try to think about the political system, but I'm going to assume that we have something roughly approaching participatory economics, paricon, as the economic system. So a lot of the problems in our political system are due to unequal resources. But hopefully, if we had a decent economy, people would have roughly equal resources, and so that problem would be much reduced. But even if we had the ideal economic system, there are still reasons why our existing political structures are inadequate. So let's first take the concept of representation, representative democracy, which is a political system that essentially says what people do is they elect other people called representatives who then represent their interests in some broader legislative body and make the decision. So people don't make the decisions. People choose the people who will make the decisions. But representative democracy has some serious problems. One is that it treats politics as a totally instrumental activity. I mentioned this briefly before. That is, it doesn't see any value to people actually thinking about their own lives and thinking about their fellow citizens' lives and trying to get involved in grappling with those problems. That participation is a positive value, and so representative democracy tends to make us ignorant. That is, you can say, I don't need to learn about this particular war over there because my representative is going to do it. And I don't really have to think about how we deal with the problem of poverty or the problems of crime or any problems at all because my representative is going to do it. And even if your representative is a good, thoughtful person, it means that you don't have the experience of thinking these things through and appreciating and learning about what these things are all about. The other problem is that representatives often don't really represent people. So in the United States, in a typical congressional district, there are something like, 600,000 to 1 million people living. So how can a representative know what every citizen in that constituency thinks? How can they really reflect their views? And you might say, well, we could have public opinion polls. But there are two problems here. One is that public opinion polls tend to catch a snapshot of people's views rather than actually deeply reflective thoughts on questions. But the other thing is that if we really said we're going to somehow find some mechanism for figuring out people's views, some kind of automated poll, and then that will become the view of the representative, we could mandate the representative. This is a practice that has been used in some countries at different times. Mandating a representative means the voters say, our representative must take this position when they go into the larger legislative body. But the problem with mandating a representative is then there's no need for the representative. You could just have a parrot that's been trained. Okay, parrot, you vote yes. And the parrot says, yes, right? Because there's no, the system is irrelevant. So if instead you want the representative to understand your position and to listen to your position and then to go and deliberate with others about it, then there's the opposite position, which is they're no longer really responsible to the group that sent them. So, we have famous situations in the United States. These weren't representatives, these were presidents. But, in 1964, there was a candidate who said, elect me and there'll be no wider war. I won't send American boys 10,000 miles away to do something that Asian boys should be doing for themselves. It was Lyndon Johnson. And no sooner did he get elected than he changed his mind, or maybe never intended to in the first place, but then started sending American boys 10,000 miles away. So what if we made him keep his campaign promises? Well, then we get into situations like Franklin Roosevelt said, I'm not going to get us into World War II, but then Pearl Harbor was bombed. You don't want him to be unable to respond to changed circumstances. So you flip back and forth. If you mandate, they'll represent you, but then nothing thoughtful can be done. If you don't mandate, and also if you mandate, you don't really need a human being in that position. If you don't mandate, they often will go off and do what they want. They'll reflect their own views, not their constituents' views. So that's a serious problem with existing representative democracy. And that how do you make sure that the representatives actually represent the views of the people? One more point. We have this problem in the United States, but it's a general problem. How do you make sure that from being in office, you don't accumulate so much power that you can never be unelected? So in typical elections in the United States, incumbents win about 90% of the time. What that suggests is that merely being an incumbent, having the power of that office, makes it very hard to dislodge you. So some people said, okay, let's have term limits. You can't serve more than 2 terms. But then there's another problem, which is in your second term, why will you vote as your constituents want? The thing that's supposed to keep representatives honest is that they want to be reelected. If you don't do what your constituents want, they'll vote against you. But if you can't run another time, you're essentially a lame duck. So there are these fundamental problems with representative democracy not translating into people's views really being reflected in the views of their representatives.
Okay, and that list of concerns obviously is not with U.S. representative democracy per se. It's rather with the best possible instance of representative democracy, even if such a thing is possible. The best possible instance of it still is flawed. And if we were to talk about methods of execution of shared program or adjudication of disputes, I think we would find similar flaws. But let's, instead of doing that, move on to how do you think about the problem of legislation? What causes you to come up with the ParPolity structures that you do come up with, and what are those structures?
Okay, so on the one hand, I think there's a value in participation, and over the years, people have come up with a number of alternatives to standard representative democracy. So one view says the following: why don't we just have everybody in the country vote on every issue? Now, that was obviously technically impossible in the past, but, the internet and computer technology makes that technically possible now. Everybody could be given, free internet access, a free computer. You could go online. You could read the background to any issue. You could punch in your 97-digit PIN number and put your thumbprint in and, facial recognition. So no cheating, and then you could vote, and you would do this on every single issue. Okay. So that might be technically possible, but there are two problems with it. One is that people just don't have the time to vote on everything. Right now, members of Congress are debating all kinds of issues, and it's pretty much a full-time activity. And yet they don't decide a whole lot of other smaller things like what day should your garbage be collected, and those kinds of things. So if you were actually voting on every decision that affected your life, there would be no time in the day. But there's another problem with what we might call referendum democracy. And that is, in a referendum, you're given a single text to vote up or down on. It doesn't get you to think about and to develop alternative wording, alternative compromises. It is a very binary process. Are you, in favor of this, or are you opposed to this? And your real position might be, well, that has some good points and bad points. Why couldn't we do this instead? But that's not possible in a referendum. A referendum is, A versus B. That's what you've got. And therefore, in referendums, people often tend to make decisions that are that don't show a lot of solidarity and tolerance, because it's really not part of the menu. The famous argument against democracy is, would we really have wanted the American people to vote in 1850 whether they wanted slavery in a referendum? Would we really wanted the German public to have voted in 1940 what should happen to Jews? Referendums tend to be absolutist and often lead to majority dictatorship, but also unreflective majority dictatorship. Okay, some say, so here's another way we can get away from representative democracy. What if we had autonomous communities? Each community, each little group of people would be totally autonomous. And so they'd be small enough to be participatory, like, those New England town meetings. And each town would be able to decide everything about their future. So there are a couple of problems here. These are generally too small to be very diverse. And many of them, of course, are actually too big also for face-to-face interactions. But put that aside, the real question is, how do we prevent one autonomous community from acting in an antisocial way towards another? So let's say there's an autonomous community on a lake. They might decide to, or be willing to pollute the lake to some degree because the water moves, or along a river, I guess. The water moves in a particular direction, so it's the downstream communities that will pay the price, and they might get some benefit. How do autonomous communities make decisions amongst themselves that are fair? Well, you could say, well, they would get together and talk about it. Okay, but what if they get together and then they disagree? If there's no way if the community is really autonomous, then no one outside can tell it what to do. And it seems like that would result in many antisocial decisions. So my alternative tries to take some of the benefits of each of these, representative democracy, referendum democracy, and autonomous communities, and tries to get the positives to meld. And this is a notion of nested councils. And the idea is everyone would be part of a council, a local council. Might have 25, it might have 50 people in it. So it's small enough that you can actually participate, not just you can send a letter to Congress, but you are actually involved in direct face-to-face conversations with your fellow citizens. But you are not an autonomous community. Your decisions will be fully binding on things that just affect you and your community, but on things that affect others, there will be a higher level council. And the lower level councils are nested inside the upper level councils, and then those councils are nested in the next set of councils. Each level may be bringing together 25 to 50, and you can sort of show mathematically that with just about 5 levels, you can include people in a country of more than 1 million people, and if you had 50 on each level, you could probably fit 500 million people. So this is the power of exponentiation. You get a lot of coverage there, and each council will send a delegate to the next higher level council to reflect the views of the sending council. But these delegates will not be mandated for the same reasons mandating representatives is a problem. If they're mandated, then there's no reason they need to meet. They can just go online, click, we vote yes or we vote no. No. Because they're not mandated, the next level council can also be a deliberative body where the delegates sit together, talk to each other, understand where each one's coming from, try to come up with a plan that is most beneficial to all. But one of the arguments against this process, which is sort of a system of indirect elections, because you elect someone in your lower level council who goes to the next level, and then they elect someone to the next level council, etc. One of the problems with indirect elections is it sometimes seems to give you an undemocratic result, and that's sort of what happens in the United States with the Electoral College. It's possible to have the Electoral College really says something like, if you have a majority in Texas, you get all of Texas's votes to the next level, which is the Electoral College meeting where the president is declared. But that might not reflect the majority of all the voters. And so in my vision, at any point, a vote that's taken in a council, in a higher level council, can get sent back to the primary level councils for final decision if it's a controversial and important and contentious issue. So if it's overwhelming in the second or third level council, no need to go back to the first level. But if it's a close vote, then it might be that the indirect election procedure has distorted the numbers, so a majority sentiment for X resulted in Y winning a narrow victory on the third level council. So send it back down. So that's the basic structure.
Let me just ask you a couple of questions about it. First off, one of your values that you put forward was liberty, the idea that I should be able to do things that I desire to do, up to the point where it infringes on others. The idea that in the economy, we call it self-management, and it's the notion that we should have a say in decisions in proportion to the degree we're affected by them. It seems like you're trying to implement this in the political realm as well.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that in your mind?
It is. But in fact, one of the big challenges in political theory is everything sort of affects everybody to some degree, right? So you might say you should have total control over the decision whether to wear that Hawaiian plaid shirt out on the street. But somebody else says, when I see that shirt, it makes me want to barf. You should, so your liberty to wear that shirt is interfering with me. So we've got to decide, is that affecting somebody else to a sufficient degree that we should restrict you? And likewise, if a community says, we'd like to have a faster speed limit on our roads than the larger community seems to want. Now, you might say, okay, so that doesn't really affect the larger community because it will only take place within the borders of that community. But it turns out that the larger community has roads that go through the smaller community. So are people then going to, face these two different kinds of drivers, wild and reckless, when you pass through this area and not when? Does that affect the larger community? These are tough questions, and you can think of thousands of issues where the exact line between how much does it affect just you or just your local community and how much does it affect others, that's an important question. And how do we decide where the decision should be made? You could have a rigid rule, and so a full classical anarchist might say the individual always makes the decision. It's never the larger group. But even the anarchist wouldn't allow murder, and so your freedom is restricted to that extent. But that's one extreme. Always put it at the lowest level there is. But the other extreme says, look, I don't want you to pollute. I don't want you to behave in antisocial ways. You're reading a book that I think will make you a little bit more of an antisocial character. So I don't think you should be allowed to read that book. And so, in fact, the other extreme is total dictatorial control by the wider society to make sure that every subunit agrees. So our challenge is, how can we set up a system that allows decisions to be made at the appropriate level without having some rigid rule? And I thought a lot about it, and I couldn't think of any sort of ironclad rule that would work in every case in terms of distinguishing what's the local level from the the larger level, and therefore we need some kind of way of resolving this problem. And this is where a court, some kind of how do you adjudicate disputes? But how do you adjudicate disputes between different levels of the society as to which one of them is mostly involved? And so I'll talk about the structure of the court a little later, but the idea is if a lower level and a higher level disagree about who actually should be making this decision and to what degree, it will go to a court, and the court will have a number of possible rulings. One possible ruling is, well, neither of you should really be deciding this. This should be an individual person's unique decision. It affects them overwhelmingly, and they should have 100% of the say. So, you can wear your Hawaiian shirt. On the other hand, they might say, this is something that has some impact on both levels, but disproportionately on the lower level, the lower level should decide this. Other times they might say, the pollution you are causing in the local community affects everyone in this larger group, larger society, larger geographic area. The larger area ruling should prevail. But there are also other possibilities. They might say there needs to be a 2/3 vote in the larger. So the larger society can impose their will on the smaller local community, but they need a 2/3 vote because it's not quite as one-sided as it might be, or it might be 2/3 the other way. So there are various gradations. We're never going to precisely have a decision-making procedure that guarantees that every decision is made exactly proportionate to the amount of impact it has on each sector. But we should try to approach that as much as possible, and that would be the one of the functions of this court system.
It's quite like in the economy, say in a workplace, the workplace council deciding the norms or the methods by which to arrive at various types of decisions, and then when the situation comes up, using those methods. It's quite similar. But let me raise a question, or actually a concern or a criticism that some folks may have. Mm-hmm. You start out with a ton of councils at the grassroots level with, as you said, maybe 25, maybe 50 people in them, whatever. Yeah. And each council appoints or delegates to a next level, and then those councils in that next level, 1/25 as many, I guess, delegate to a next level, and so on. And you get to a top level, and it takes 4 or 5 levels, maybe 6 or 7 at the absolute most, in, say, China, with a very high population. But when you get to that top level, we're talking about 25 to 50 people. And so somehow this incredibly participatory dynamic has still got not one person as president, so to speak, but let's say 25 to 50 people as a top-level body. What's to prevent that top-level body from usurping the entire thing, or at least corrupting the entire thing or distorting the entire thing?
Okay, so
it seems...
Yeah. That's obviously a very serious concern. So one thing is you have rotation, that is, delegates cannot continue in office. They've got to take turns. It probably doesn't make sense to have everybody rotate through every member. It should only rotate through those who are sufficiently interested to do so. But one sure way to prevent someone from becoming a permanent dictator is not to allow them to be there permanently. Okay. But in addition, all the meetings are fully visible. They're videotaped and in an archive that everybody can see. But in addition, people at the top levels don't get to make final decisions if anyone down below objects. So if they have some resolution that the top level says, we think this should happen, it can always be requested that it go down to the primary levels for essentially what amounts to a vote of the whole population.
Yeah, but that can't be at the behest of just one person at a lower level that doesn't like the decision.
No, right. So
that would paralyze everything.
No, right. So you'd obviously work out some number, like if this many lower level councils request it, the vote comes down. Now, sometimes you may not be happy with the decision at the top, but you do indeed believe, having followed the debate along, at the different levels, you do believe, this seems to be, the sentiment of a majority of the people. So I'm not going to waste time and have us come down and, vote down below. Right. But other times you'll say, I think this could be very close, and I think we, might be able to persuade people otherwise, because I think there are arguments we haven't yet put forward. And so we'd like to go, and as you say, it can't be 1% doing it, but you probably wouldn't require, 45% of the population requiring it. That would, be too extreme. And people would have to decide what the trade-off is between convenience of not having too many unnecessary votes versus the safety of, avoiding the dangers of dictatorship.
Which is ultimately the same issue as before, that is resolving in some sense various types of dispute, various types of decision, and having a sort of an algorithm that everyone respects as a way to deal with it. So in this case, it would be, I don't know, maybe if 1/3 of the councils at the next lower level or some other algorithm disagrees with an upper level decision, then it goes back down. Let me ask you one more question.
Yeah.
At the lowest level, you had, again, everyone in the population is in a local council, presumably in their neighborhood, or really even maybe just part of a neighborhood. And then it goes up, and people are delegated to higher level councils up to, let's say, 6 levels up. At the lowest level, people obviously are not in any sense professionals at politics. It's the whole population. So there are people there. You mentioned that we would make this consistent with participatory economics. So there are people there who are doing all kinds of different jobs, each person doing a mix, doing a balanced job complex. So people in these councils are confident, and they have experience making decisions and diverse skills. But it's not as if they've been trained to be a 4th level politico or a top level politico. And not only that, you're recalling them on a regular basis if lower levels don't respect what they're doing, and you're even rotating them, them so that there's not too long of a term of office. So in that situation, what happens, or what do you say to the person who says, well, it all sounds sort of nice, detailed, I have to think it through to be sure, but are we getting good decisions? Are these people enmeshed enough in the process of the politics and in the process of decision-making to become really good at it? Or are they just frittering around and making these important deliberations and choices without a whole lot of experience?
Well, so, that same question comes up in the existing United States government. How do these people, whose training might be, they're not a cross section of the population, but maybe they're lawyers, but there are very few scientists. There are very few people in a bunch of important technical areas that their votes are going to impact. How do we do that? Well, they have a staff, right? That is, members of Congress, the committees of Congress have a staff of experts who help in the, how can we draw up a bill that accomplishes these ends that the political system says are worthy ends, but where the individuals who are going to be voting on the bill may not, sort of know enough of the technical details. And so the councils from the second level on up would have staff. And the staff would be the folks who work on the technical aspects of the political decisions, but the political decision-making power is in the hands of the councils, in the sort of democratic structure. Now, is there the danger that those with expertise, the staff, will skew results? Yes, that's why there'll be a lot of councils with a lot of staff, and contending views can be put forward. If the staff always seems to say the best system here would be to give people who have a particular technical expertise twice the standard of living of everyone else, hopefully we'd see through that and wouldn't allow that to happen. But the notion that there are technical questions and there are political questions, and we want to make sure that people with the technical expertise don't have the political power to make a decision. Their job is present the technical facts so that people can democratically, even non-expert people, can democratically come to the best decision. I should, I haven't yet explained where these council courts come from, and that's an important piece here. So let me just say a word about that.
Well, why don't you take up now judicial functions per se, the ones that you're now talking about, and also whatever else you think has to be part of the ParPolity model bearing on judicial relations.
Yeah. So one of the big challenges in democratic theory is this: you might pass laws, but you're still going to have to interpret whether this action actually violated that law. So, we have free speech in the United States, but does hate speech count as speech that should be permitted or not? What about pornography? What about incitement? Where do you draw the line on different things? There's no way you can anticipate all that in writing the law in the first place. You're going to need some kind of body to decide. Moreover, you're going to need some kind of body to protect minorities. The majority might vote a particular way, but what if that vote infringes on the essential rights of a minority community? So we have judicial institutions that in part are charged with that task: protect minorities, interpret laws. How do we make sure? So who should be doing those judicial decisions? And here's the dilemma in democratic theory. If these people are elected, then they are likely to be subject to the same passions and prejudices as the majority. So, if we had judges in 1850 in the United States that were fully elected, and we asked the judges, do you want to protect the rights of African Americans? They, having been elected by a racist majority would have racist decisions. So you might say, okay, so we need to shield those judges from popular passions, so they shouldn't be elected. But then you end up with an unelected group of people who is just an elite group with no guarantee that they reflect popular values. And so, in the United States, we say to make sure they're not elected, they'll be appointed by an elected person, the president and the Senate confirming, but then they have life terms. So that means if over the course of a generation, the American people change their approach to something, change their values, their court will not reflect that. That seems pretty rotten, pretty undemocratic. Why should this group of unelected people be doing these things? But if the judges were all elected and they appealed to the same, anti-immigrant or white supremacist sentiments, now, which I hope are not majority sentiments, but if they were, if that were a majority sentiment among the American people, an elected court would reflect that. So my solution is this. We know from some very interesting experiments done by James Fishkin that if you take a bunch of people and you ask them, what are your opinions on these questions? They have a bunch of views, a range of views, and some of them are pretty retrograde and pretty rotten. However, if you first let those people deliberate for a while, talk about the issues, discuss among themselves for a while, and then we ask their opinions, their deliberative opinions turn out to be, although Fishkin doesn't use these terms, much more consistent with the values we cared about, the liberty, the justice, the solidarity, etc., than their original unreflective views. So the check on the power of the majority, I think, still has to be a democratic elected, a democratic body, but it should be chosen like the jury. That is, it should be chosen randomly from the population. So it's not the same electoral structure that led to the councils. And these people will then deliberate, and they will be a check on the councils perhaps acting in a way that as a majority violates minority rights. Now, obviously, there's no guarantee here, but the alternative, have some unelected elite protect minority rights, that's just not very comforting that will actually offer protection because they themselves will become anti-democratic and elitist. On the other hand, having an elected body, well, we elected, if elected councils acted racistly, in a racist manner, then an elected judge would do the same. But if, however, we choose like a jury, choose randomly, and then make it a deliberative body that maybe 40 people, 41 people, to have an odd number, and they deliberate, there might be the best chance of minimizing the biases and prejudices that undermine minority rights.
It's a lot to think about. It turns out that political systems are, in fact, more difficult to envision than economic. And I suspect this will follow through as we deal with other realms of life. And it's because I suspect economics is a bit more cut and dried, a bit more quantifiable. The issues still exist, but they come into prominence here more than there. But what happens when people violate norms? So, for instance, in a good society, do you envision, as some anarchists do, that, well, crime just disappears because there's no more class division, and let's say as well that we figure out ways to structure institutions to minimize or even eliminate racism, sexism? Does that mean that there's no crime? And if there is crime, if it is still possible for somebody to abuse somebody else or even kill somebody else or steal or whatever, are there police? Which is part of a political system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how do you feel about that? Do you rule out police, as some on the left would do, or say, for example, as some would say, well, the police function, maybe it has to happen, but we should all do it? Or do you acknowledge that there's such a thing as dealing with violations, and it does take certain skills, just like, say, flying an airplane takes certain skills. And so we have people who are employed in that capacity, but their situation is conducive to their behaving in a proper manner rather than to their violating their mandates.
Yeah. So, one of the depressing realizations of any young person on the left is, we originally went into these things. We thought a new world is coming. We've got new values. And then you'd be in organizations where you'd see people behaving in very pathological ways. And this wasn't your local capitalist. This was, sort of a fellow member of your political organization. People have serious problems for psychological reasons, for sociological reasons, and that's true even in a very well-defined leftist context. And so, of course, it's going to be true in a larger society. Now, you might say, okay, but 50 years down the pike, when we no longer have people who've grown up in the debilitating situation of racist, sexist capitalism, then we'll no longer have these problems. I certainly think that a decent economic system and a participatory political system and addressing in a fundamental way some of the gender and racial, ethnic, cultural divergences will drastically reduce the level of antisocial behavior. But it seems to me unlikely that those will go to zero. And if they do go to zero, well, at that point we can say, okay, just like we no longer need people who put horseshoes on anymore, because there's no longer a social need for that job. Okay, we no longer need police. I'm doubtful that will ever be the case, but if it is, we can address it in the distant future, but it certainly won't be the case in the immediate future. Large numbers of people will not be incarcerated. We will not be a police state, particularly in the eyes of different minority groups. Okay, but it's unlikely that we will not have any domestic violence at all, that we will not have people who will drive in antisocial ways. People who, speed by 20 miles an hour are probably putting other people's lives at risk, and it's something that we don't want to happen. And I'm not certain that that kind of behavior will all disappear. So it seems to me we have to anticipate that in any large-scale society, there will be antisocial behavior that's going to require us to address it. Now, we ought to be much more focused on a rehabilitative rather than a retributionist model of addressing these things. That in turn will reduce the problems over time. So that would be an important difference. And that's actually the spirit of a criminal justice system. Remember, in many states they call it their corrections system, right? We're trying to correct people. Penitentiaries for people who are penitent rather than as torture chambers. That's the sort of original rhetoric, but that makes sense as a way to treat antisocial behavior. So can we say we will just arm the people and they will be the police? Well, there are a couple of problems there. One is, I think the way you formulated it, just like flying a plane is a skill that not everybody needs to learn to do or may even be competent at doing. Police work, likewise, is a skill that not everybody is competent or may be interested in doing. It's a job that has one very particular skill, which is the skill of, not often met in today's United States, but the particular skill that's called for is the ability to promote pro-social behavior without violating people's rights. So if we just said, there's been a crime out there, everybody go home, get your rifle from over your mantle, see what you can find out, well, so people are going to take their rifles and barge into people's homes and look for evidence and track down and talk to witnesses. And are they going to talk to witnesses understanding the legal and illegal ways to proceed? Are they going to search using legal versus illegal rules? All these are very complicated things, and police don't do a very good job of it now, but our aspiration should be that this is a skilled, complicated job, and we want people who are well-trained and well-skilled to fly our planes, and we want the same thing for those who have the very delicate task of protecting us while at the same time protecting our rights.
Well, you've described lots of the difficult problems and issues that arise when you think about political vision, and you've also offered a particular approach to dealing with those problems called participatory polity. To round out this particular episode of Revolution Z, why do you think having a political vision of the sort that you describe is something that can actually help us attain a better world? In other words, it might be intellectually interesting, and it might be necessary someday. But why do you think that right now, when clearly we're not on the verge of implementing the political vision you describe, nonetheless, right now it would be good if people who are activists and who are trying to create a better world had something like the vision that you describe in mind while they're doing that? Why is that desirable? Why is it a agenda item for now as compared to an agenda item for some time down the road, who knows when?
It's been a truism among many of those who've talked about visions of a better society, that it's not just something that's out there in the future, but it serves two important purposes now. One is that it allows us to measure any particular change, any particular reform, as to whether it is heading us in the right direction or heading us in the wrong direction. So to take an extreme case, you might say, oh, here's a good strategy for us. If we lie to people and tell them X, it'll help us get some short-term goal that we want. Well, the problem with that is what that also does is it treats people as instrumental. It doesn't allow people to participate. It violates some of our principles and ultimately undermines our long-term goals. So having a vision, and this is true about politics as well as anything else, allows you to have some way to determine whether this particular reform is heading us in the right direction or heading us in the wrong direction. Second of all, in terms of politics in particular, it does give us certain things to watch out for as we're setting up our political organizations. Now, I don't want to carry this too far and say that, everything we do today prefigures or in embryonic form represents what's coming, because there are a lot of times you can't do that. Some environmental activists climbed up in trees as a way to prevent reckless destruction of trees. They weren't really saying that what we're hoping for is a society where we're all, living in trees. No, some things you do are not part of prefiguration of future vision. But what it does mean is when we have an organization today and we have a bunch of people in the organization, one of the things we should be thinking about, just as we will be thinking about it in our primary councils one day in the future, is, are we preparing all our members to participate rather than just to blindly accept leadership? So, on the left, was this, the recent collapse of the International Socialist Organization. One of the lessons of that collapse was that the leadership, because of their hierarchical Leninist structure, became detached from the members. Although the members were very committed, they said, we'll let someone else make these decisions for us. We don't need to really participate in the decision-making. We'll let those with more experience and knowledge do it for us. And that led to disaster. In general, thinking about ways that we can increase participation as well as increase liberty and justice and solidarity and tolerance, those will be good for our movements today on the way to that vision for the future.
Okay, Steve, I want to thank you for coming on. I want to acknowledge something I'm worried about. I think you've set the bar very, very high for guests. I hope they aren't intimidated by your care and precision in dealing with the issues. But I think it was excellent, and I hope that you'll come back on before too long to talk about current political events, in particular the election cycle that we're going through, probably the most important that we've ever experienced, you and I in our lifetimes, and maybe anyone in their lifetimes. So maybe we can agree that that'll be a topic for a future podcast or a future episode of Revolution Z in which you will visit again. What do you think about that?
I think that would be great. But there are also other things I'm now saying to myself, we didn't get to this topic. So we didn't talk about consensus versus majority decision-making. And maybe on another visit, we might, take up that question, or a little bit, more about executive functions. So obviously there was more than could fit into even an extended hour. So I'd be delighted to come back and talk about it.
Great. I had the advantage when I did the economics section of being the host and using about 15 episodes. So I well understand the frustration that might arise in trying to address it all in one episode. So indeed, we can also talk about political vision again, as well as about current political events. But for now, this is Mike Albert, the host of Revolution Z, saying goodbye until next time.